Today we're going to remove and replace the front strut towers on the 93 Del Sol SI. Basically, before you do anything, remove anything after you've jacked up the car and put it on safety stands and remove the front wheels, you will want to loosen 5 bolts and hit them with PB Blaster or some type of penetrating lube, maybe for a day beforehand if you've still got original equipment on there that's been there for a while. But you want to make sure you can loosen all 5 of these bolts before you go removing anything. So I'm going to show you the 5 bolts you need to loosen. There are the 2 17mm bolts at the top of the strut tower, 1, 2 right here. If you have a strut tower brace on there, you can even leave it on there based on the design. As long as I can get to those bolts, I'll be fine. Then underneath the car there are 2 12mm bolts that hold the brake lines to the strut tower, and you'll have to get these off so you don't get the brake lines out of your way. So there's one here and there's one right on the underside right there. So those are both 12mm. There's a 14mm pinch bolt that is at the very top of the suspension fork down here. That's this one right here. You want to make sure that one loose. And then there's a 17mm bolt going all the way through the bottom of the suspension fork. There's a nut on one side, should be like a castle nut on that side, and on the other side you'll see that there's the head. And you'll want to make sure that you can make good movement on all of those before you continue with anything. Once you've loosened all of those bolts, the first step is going to come back to the top ones, and you're going to want to loosen them until there are just a few threads left on them. We're not going to take those bolts off. We just want that so that as we take off the bottom pieces, when this strut tower starts to come down, it'll just get caught by those bolts and be supported that way. Next, we're going to remove these 2 12mm bolts that are holding the brake line against the strut tower. Once those 2 bolts are off, the brake line will just be out of the way, so just kind of be aware of that as you're removing the strut tower. And we're next going to go after this 14mm bolt that is securing the fork to the bottom of the strut tower. I just took out that 14mm bolt, and you can see what a typical corrosion situation is like in there. This is even after using that PB Blaster, which is why you definitely want to use a penetrating lube before you go after these, and why we're going to put anti-seize on them when we put them back in. After that 14mm bolt, we're going to go for the one at the very bottom of the suspension fork, which has a castle nut on one side and a 17mm bolt head on the other side right here. And I'm going to show you the setup I used to get that free. Here you can see I have my 17mm socket on the head of the bolt, but as you turn the bolt, the nut is going to spin also. So on the other side, I've taken a 17mm box wrench around the head of that bolt, and basically the extension of the wrench will come up against the lower arm down there as I turn the bolt on the other side, and will keep the nut held in place. Once the nut is all the way off on this side, you're probably going to have to hit this with a sledgehammer, a mini sledge, and just kind of knock it out that way, or insert a punch to complete extracting this bolt from the other side. It's just being held in by tension right now. Once those bolts are off from the suspension fork, you can just work this down off of the bottom of the strut tower, just pull it down, and then just pull it away and set it aside. Now that fork is out of the way, just sitting on the ground over here. Again, because we had left those top bolts on the top of the strut tower just very loosely in place, this mechanism will not fall down. It's hanging there, and it's not that heavy, and you have plenty of space. You can just grab it with one hand and hold it tight with the other one hand, while you just loosen the top bolts with your other hand and just kind of support it and work the whole thing out from here. Nothing's going to be in our way. Just watch out for these brake lines. Assuming you're replacing your struts or your springs and you need to recover this top hat portion, we're going to have to use a spring compressor to squeeze this together so that we can get this loose and get this off. That's assuming you're not just putting in a whole new complete assembly. So assuming we have to do that, I just want to point out that the spacing between the factory coils is very narrow. It's only about a ½ inch in between here. So the standard strut spring compressors you get that have a little hook at the end that you have to work in, those hooks aren't going to clear this, at least not the ones that I was able to find. So we have to use this kind, which is just the flat platform that can stick in so that we can actually get in between these springs. So that just make sure that if you're going to go borrow a spring compressor from the part store, if you don't have one, that you make sure you get one that has these flat blades instead of the hooks that go around. Once the springs are compressed enough that we've got tension off of the top hat, we put a 5mm Allen head on the end here. There's a slot inside the end of this center shaft. We're going to brace that Allen wrench against the ground so that as we turn the nut, the shaft won't spin with it, so that we can actually just use a 14mm open wrench here, and you can just work that nut off, and then this will keep the shaft from spinning, and then we'll just remove this nut all the way off, disassemble. I'm not going to go through that whole process because I don't know what you're planning to do with this. I just wanted to show you this little trick to get this top hat off. We're reassembling in reverse order, so just held up the new strut in place with one hand while I just reached over with the other hand and put these two nuts on lightly just so they won't fall out of place. And then we'll just put the suspension fork back on with its bolts, putting anti-seize and everything, and then we'll reattach the brake brackets. Once you get these bolts back in, the pinch bolt up here at the top of the fork should be tightened to 32 foot-pounds, and the one at the bottom of the suspension fork should be tightened to 65. So just tighten up those two, and then we'll reattach the brake line brackets to the strut arm there. And we won't we'll just hand tighten the ones on the very top of the strut tower. Those won't get their final torque until we've put the wheels back on and get everything back on the ground. Wheels are back on. Lowered the car off of the jack stands, and then we just need to tighten the wheel bolts to 80 foot-pounds, and then tighten on both sides the strut tower bolts to 25, and we're all set.